They tell you that getting old means learning to accept help. That there's dignity in letting others care for you when your body can no longer do what it once did. They don't tell you about the other lesson. The one you learn when you're at your most vulnerable. When pain makes you grateful for any hand extended, when loneliness makes you trust too easily. I learned that lesson in the weeks after my surgery, in the slow morning hours, when light crept across my floor and I waited for the knock at my door. 9 o'clock, every morning, precisely on time. I learned that help isn't always kind. That some hands don't lift you up, they hold you down. That the worst violations happen quietly, in ordinary apartments, behind locked doors, while the rest of the world goes on, oblivious. This is the story of how I almost didn't survive the person who came to help me heal. The knock came at exactly 9 in the morning, just as the agency had promised. I had been awake since 6. Sitting in the armchair by the window with my walker positioned nearby, watching the morning light creep across the hardwood floor. It moved so slowly, that light. Inch by inch, transforming the room from gray to gold. 3 days home from the rehabilitation center. And I was still adjusting to the silence of my apartment. To the way every movement sent a dull ache through my hip. To the strange reality that my body had become something I could no longer trust. The apartment felt larger than it used to. Emptier. The distance from the bedroom to the bathroom had become a journey. The walk to the kitchen, an expedition that required planning and rest stops. I had always lived alone 15 years since Harold died, but this was different. This wasn't solitude. This was isolation wrapped around vulnerability. And it frightened me in ways I hadn't expected. I called out that the door was unlocked, my voice sounding thin in the quiet. The agency had told me her name was Carla, 28 years old, certified in post-surgical care. What they hadn't told me was how she would fill a doorway, not with size, but with presence, or how her arrival would mark the moment I stopped being entirely my own. She stepped inside wearing navy blue scrubs that rustled softly as she moved, carrying an oversized tote bag that looked heavy enough to contain her entire life. Her smile was wide and bright, the kind of smile that seemed like it had been practiced in a mirror until it looked natural, until all the rough edges had been smoothed away. She told me how nice it was to meet me, how we were going to get along wonderfully, how she'd taken care of dozens of patients just like me. Her voice was warm, professional, exactly what you'd expect from someone trained to care for the elderly and infirm. I nodded and tried to return the smile, but something about the way she looked around my apartment made my shoulders tense. Her eyes moved quickly, cataloging, assessing, taking inventory of my life in a series of rapid glances. She walked past me toward the kitchen, already comfortable, already at home, and set her bag on the counter with a solid thump. The apartment smelled faintly of the coffee I'd made earlier. Too much effort, but I'd needed to prove to myself I could still do it. But her perfume, something floral and too sweet, was already replacing it, claiming the air. Then she saw it. The small ceramic bird my daughter had given me last Christmas, sitting on the windowsill above the sink where the morning light could catch its painted wings. Carla picked it up without asking, turned it over in her hands with casual familiarity, examined the delicate blue and white pattern. She told me it was lovely, really quite lovely, and asked if I collected birds. Before I could answer, before I could tell her it was a gift, that it meant something, she'd placed it back down, but not quite where it had been. Just slightly to the left, facing a different direction, like it belonged to her now, like everything here might soon belong to her. By the end of the first week, Carla had woven herself into the fabric of my days so completely that I could barely remember what the hours had felt like before she arrived. She came each morning at exactly 9. Her knock always the same 3 sharp raps followed by her cheerful voice calling out a greeting. She stayed until 4, moving through my apartment with an efficiency that should have been comforting. That probably would have been comforting if something about it didn't feel quite so much like an occupation. She prepared soft meals that were easy on my recovering system: scrambled eggs with toast in the morning, soup and sandwiches for lunch, simple pastas or chicken for dinner before she left. The smells filled my apartment in ways they hadn't in years, not since I'd grown used to eating cereal, standing at the counter, or heating frozen meals in the microwave. She fluffed the pillows behind my back without being asked, adjusted the blinds to let in just the right amount of light, and kept up a steady stream of conversation that filled the spaces I'd grown accustomed to leaving empty. At first, I was grateful for the company. The silence of recovery had been oppressive, each day stretching out like a desert I had to cross alone. But as the days passed, I began to notice things. She talked about herself easily, too easily perhaps. The words flowed out of her in a constant stream, stories about her life that seemed designed to fill the air between us. On Monday, she told me she'd grown up in Vermont while she was washing dishes, that she missed the mountains terribly, the way they looked in autumn when the leaves turned. She described it so vividly: the smell of wood smoke, the crisp air, the particular quality of light through red and gold leaves that I could almost see it. On Wednesday, she mentioned her childhood in upstate New York while she was folding the blanket at the foot of my bed. How she'd always loved the lake country, how the sound of water against the shore at night had been the soundtrack of her youth. Again, the details were rich and specific. The call of loons, the way the morning mist rose off the water, the particular green of the pines. I thought perhaps I'd misheard the first time, that my pain medication was making me foggy, making my memory unreliable. The pills did that sometimes, made the edges of things blur, made yesterday feel like last week. But then on Friday, she was telling me about her mother while she prepared my lunch. The kitchen filled with the smell of chicken soup, warm and ordinary, steam rising from the pot on the stove. She said her mother had passed away 5 years ago, that it had been sudden, a heart attack. No warning. Just there one day and gone the next. I could hear the grief in her voice, or what sounded like grief, and I offered my condolences. She thanked me with that practiced smile, her eyes soft with what looked like genuine sadness. Except I was almost certain she'd mentioned calling her mother just 2 days earlier, complaining about the traffic on her drive to work. The words had been so specific: something about construction on Route 9. About how her mother had suggested taking the back roads instead. I could still hear the casual way she'd said it, talking about her mother in the present tense, as someone living and advice-giving and very much alive. I watched her move around my kitchen, humming that tuneless melody that had already become familiar, and wondered if I should say something. But the words felt heavy in my mouth, impossible to shape into a question that wouldn't sound like an accusation. And maybe I was just confused. Maybe the surgery had affected me more than I wanted to admit. The doctors had warned me about the anesthesia, how it could linger in older bodies, how it could affect memory and cognition for weeks after the procedure. Maybe I was the one who couldn't keep things straight anymore. The thought settled over me like a cold cloth, uncomfortable and clinging. I sat there in my chair, watching Carla hum and stir the soup, and felt the ground beneath me shift in ways that had nothing to do with my healing hip. I noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon while Carla was in the kitchen preparing my dinner. I'd needed to use the bathroom and had made the slow journey down the hallway with my walker, my hip protesting every step with that deep, grinding ache that the pills only dulled but never quite erased. The walker's rubber feet made soft squeaking sounds against the hardwood floor, a rhythm I'd learned to pace myself by. Squeak, step, pause. Squeak, step, pause. On the way back, I paused at my bedroom door, something catching my eye, a wrongness in the familiar landscape of my own space. The top drawer of my dresser stood open, just barely. Maybe 2 inches of space between the drawer front and the frame, a dark gap that shouldn't have been there. I stood there staring at it, my hands gripping the walker handles until my knuckles went white, until I could feel the indentations of the foam grips pressing into my palms. The afternoon light came through the bedroom window at an angle, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Everything else in the room looked exactly as I'd left it: the book on the nightstand, the reading glasses folded on top, the small clock with its red digital numbers glowing faintly in the daylight. But that drawer was open. It held my personal things. Old letters from my late husband, their envelopes yellowed with time, the paper inside thin and fragile from being unfolded and refolded over the years. They still carried the faint smell of his cologne, or maybe I just imagined they did, needed them to. A jewelry box with the few good pieces I owned, my engagement ring that no longer fit my fingers, the pearl earrings Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary, the gold watch that had been his mother's, photographs I hadn't looked at in years but couldn't bear to put away, images of a life that felt both intensely real and impossibly distant. And I never left that drawer open. 60 years of living alone, first in apartments when I was young, then in this place with Harold, then alone again after he died, had made me careful about such things. Close the drawer, lock the door, turn off the stove. These weren't just habits. They were anchors, small certainties in a world that had taken too many things from me already. They were the rituals that held chaos at bay. I made my way into the room, each step deliberate and slow, and pushed the drawer closed with one hand while still gripping the walker with the other. I listened for the familiar click of wood meeting wood, that small sound of order restored. Everything inside looked undisturbed, arranged exactly as I'd left it. The letters in their bundle, tied with the blue ribbon. The jewelry box in its spot in the corner. The photographs face down because I couldn't bear to see them every time I opened the drawer. Perhaps I had forgotten this once. The thought moved through my mind like something cold and unwelcome. Perhaps the medication was making me careless in ways I couldn't see, couldn't track. Perhaps I was becoming the confused old woman everyone seemed to expect me to be. From the kitchen, Carla called out that dinner was ready. Her voice sounded cheerful, innocent, floating down the hallway over the clatter of plates being set on the table. I looked at the closed drawer one more time, running my hand over its smooth surface, feeling the slight indentation where the wood had been worn by decades of opening and closing. I could smell something in the room that hadn't been there before, not my lavender sachets, not the faint staleness of a space that wasn't aired out enough. Something floral and sweet. Carla's perfume. The unease sat heavy in my chest like a stone, solid and cold, as I turned away and began the slow journey back down the hallway. It happened on Thursday, just after lunch. I'd dozed off in my armchair, the afternoon sun warm on my face, a heavy blanket of light that pressed me down into the cushions. My medication pulled me under into that fuzzy half-sleep where the world becomes distant and dreamlike, where sounds lose their edges and time stretches into something elastic and unreliable. I floated there, suspended between waking and sleeping, aware of my body but not quite inhabiting it. The radiator ticked its steady rhythm in the corner, that familiar metallic percussion that had marked the winters of my life in this apartment. Outside, a car alarm chirped once, twice, then fell silent. Somewhere above me, footsteps crossed a ceiling that wasn't mine. Carla's voice woke me, or maybe I'd been hearing it for a while, threaded through my dreams until it became substantial enough to pull me toward consciousness. Low and urgent, coming from the kitchen. The tone was different from the cheerful voice she used with me, stripped of that careful warmth. I kept my eyes closed, not quite ready to surface, caught in that strange state where pretending to sleep feels safer than acknowledging you're awake. And that's when I heard her say my name. Grace. She spoke it plainly, without the gentle prefix of Mrs. she always used to my face. Just my first name, casual and familiar, like I was an object being discussed rather than a person who might overhear. She was speaking quietly, almost whispering, but my apartment was small and sound carried in ways I'd learned over the years. The refrigerator hummed its constant note. The radiator ticked. And underneath it all, Carla's voice, careful and measured, telling whoever was on the other end that I was doing fine, very manageable, that there wouldn't be any problems. The words themselves seemed innocent enough. Exactly what you'd expect her to report to a supervisor. But something in her tone made my stomach tighten, made the warm afternoon suddenly feel cold against my skin. Then she said something about the timeline, about making sure everything was in place before the daughter visited. My daughter, Sarah. My eyes snapped open but I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I stayed perfectly still in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs while I strained to hear more. The radiator ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Carla's voice dropped even lower and I caught only fragments after that, pieces of sentences that floated toward me through the doorway. Something about access. Something about being careful. Something about not rushing things, about waiting for the right moment. The words felt dangerous somehow, sharp-edged and deliberate. They had weight to them, intention. This wasn't the casual conversation of a home aide checking in with her supervisor. This was something else entirely. When she walked back into the living room a few minutes later, I was sitting up straight, watching her. The afternoon light behind her turned her into a silhouette, her features lost in shadow. I asked her who she'd been talking to, keeping my voice level, curious but not accusatory. Her smile didn't waver. It stayed fixed in place like something painted on, unchanging. She told me it was just her supervisor at the agency, a routine check-in, nothing to worry about. She laughed, a light sound that seemed practiced, and said she knew how it sounded. All that medical jargon probably seemed mysterious to patients. Her voice was dismissive, gently condescending, the way you'd speak to a child who'd misunderstood something simple. But I'd heard my daughter's name. I was certain of it. The syllables were still echoing in my mind, clear and unmistakable. Sarah. I kept $40 in my purse, always. 2 20s folded together in the zippered pocket on the inside. Tucked away where they wouldn't accidentally fall out or get mixed up with receipts and loose change. Emergency money, my husband used to call it, though I'd never been quite sure what emergency would require exactly $40. Not enough for a hospital visit, too much for a taxi I'd probably never take. But Harold had been insistent about it, had checked periodically to make sure the money was there, and after he died, I'd kept the habit alive like I'd kept so many of his habits alive. Small rituals that made him feel less gone. The purse itself was old, brown leather worn soft and supple from years of use, the strap permanently curved from hanging over my arm. I knew every compartment, every pocket, every small tear in the lining. I knew the sound it made when I set it down, the weight of it, the smell of the leather mixed with the faint scent of the mints I kept in the outer pocket. On Friday morning, while Carla was helping me with my exercises, I asked her to bring me my purse from the bedroom. I wanted to check if Sarah had sent that card she'd mentioned on the phone, a thinking of you card. She'd said, nothing elaborate, just something to remind me she was there even though she couldn't visit as often as she'd like. The guilt in her voice had been palpable, and I'd assured her I was fine, that she didn't need to worry. But I wanted that card. I wanted the tangible proof that someone was thinking of me. Carla returned with the purse and set it on the side table beside my chair, then guided me through the leg lifts the physical therapist had prescribed. She counted aloud while I lifted and lowered, my muscles burning with the effort, sweat beading on my forehead despite the coolness of the room. The morning light was thin and gray, threatening rain. Later, after she'd gone to start lunch, I could hear her in the kitchen. The sound of the refrigerator opening and closing, water running, the clink of dishes. I opened the purse and checked the zippered pocket. My fingers found the opening automatically, muscle memory from years of reaching into that same spot. Empty. My heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the exercises. I checked again, certain I must have missed it, that my fingers had simply failed to find the folded bills. I searched every compartment, every fold of fabric, my movements becoming more frantic even as I tried to stay calm. The main section, the outer pockets, the small zippered pouch where I kept my insurance cards. Nothing. The 20s were gone. I sat back in my chair, the purse open on my lap, and tried to think. Had I taken the money out? Had I used it for something and forgotten to replace it? The surgery had been expensive even with insurance. Maybe I'd needed cash for something at the pharmacy. But no, I remembered specifically checking the money was there before I went to the hospital. Remembered the small comfort of knowing it was tucked away safe. When Carla came back with my soup tomato, the smell rich and comforting, steam rising from the bowl, one told her about the missing money. I tried to keep my voice casual, curious rather than accusatory, as if I were simply puzzled by a small mystery. I watched her face carefully as I spoke, searching for any flicker of guilt or recognition. She set down the tray and sat beside me, folding herself into the chair with that fluid grace young people have, the kind of easy movement I could barely remember. Her expression was full of gentle concern, her eyebrows drawn together, her head tilted slightly to one side. She asked if I was sure I'd put money there recently, her voice so kind, so patient. She reminded me that memory could be tricky after surgery, that the medications sometimes caused confusion. She'd seen it with other patients, she said. They'd be absolutely certain about something, where they'd put their keys, whether they'd taken their pills, who had called, and then later they'd realize they'd been mistaken. It was nothing to be ashamed of, she assured me. It was just how the body responded to trauma and medication. She suggested maybe I'd moved it somewhere safe and forgotten, that it would turn up. These things always did, she said with that practiced smile. Maybe in a coat pocket or a drawer, tucked away during a moment I couldn't quite recall. Her voice was so reasonable, so kind, so understanding that for a moment I almost believed her, almost let myself sink into the comfort of that explanation. The idea that this was my failing rather than something more sinister. It would be easier, wouldn't it? To accept that I was confused rather than to accept that I was being stolen from in my own home. I nodded slowly and told her she was probably right, that I must have misremembered. I picked up my spoon and started eating the soup, making my face calm, making my hands steady even though they wanted to shake. The soup was good, perfectly seasoned, exactly the right temperature. She was a good cook. That was real. But inside, I was taking note of everything. The way she'd answered too quickly, before I'd even finished explaining. The way her eyes had flickered toward her tote bag for just a fraction of a second, an unconscious glance that revealed more than her words. The way she seemed relieved when I accepted her explanation, her shoulders dropping slightly, her smile becoming more genuine. I wasn't confused. My mind might be slower than it used to be, my body might be failing me, but I knew what had been in that purse. I knew my own rituals, my own careful habits. And I wasn't going to forget this. Not this. Linda knocked on my door Saturday afternoon while Carla was in the bathroom. The sound was different from Carla's knock, softer, more tentative. The knock of someone who wasn't sure of their welcome. We'd been neighbors for 8 years, Linda and I, sharing the occasional cup of tea and complaints about the building management. She was 71, a year younger than me but somehow seeming older lately, her arthritis worse than my hip had ever been. Still, her mind was sharp as ever, and she didn't miss much that happened on our floor. I called out for her to come in, and she opened the door slowly, peering around it before entering fully. She told me she'd brought some cookies she'd baked, her voice louder than necessary, projecting in a way that seemed deliberate. Oatmeal raisin, she announced, my favorite, though I couldn't remember ever expressing a preference for oatmeal raisin cookies. I heard the bathroom door open down the hall, the distinctive creak of the hinge I'd been meaning to oil for months. I saw Linda's eyes flick in that direction, saw something in her expression shift, become more guarded. Carla appeared in the hallway, smiling, drying her hands on a towel. She introduced herself as my home aide, her voice warm and professional, exactly as it always was with outsiders. Linda was polite, friendly even, chatting about the weather and how lovely it had been this week, about the broken elevator that had been out of service for 3 days now, making life difficult for everyone on the upper floors. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning products from the morning's maintenance. That sharp chemical scent that never quite masked the underlying smell of old building dust and wood and decades of living. Carla and Linda stood there making small talk, 2 women who'd never met before, exchanging the kinds of pleasantries that meant nothing and everything. Linda complimented Carla on her dedication, said it was wonderful that I had such attentive care. Carla accepted the praise graciously, said she loved her work, that helping people was its own reward. I watched them from my chair, aware that something was happening beneath the surface of this conversation, something I couldn't quite name. Then Linda moved toward me, holding out the container of cookies. It was plastic, the kind with the blue lid that everyone seemed to have, slightly worn from years of use. As she handed it to me, I felt something else pressed against my palm. Paper, folded small and tight, small enough to hide in a closed fist. Linda's eyes met mine for just a fraction of a second, a look that conveyed urgency without words. I kept my hand closed around the note, my fingers curling naturally around the container so the paper was hidden between my palm and the plastic. The texture of it was rough against my skin, regular paper folded multiple times, the edges sharp. Linda made her goodbyes, promising to visit again soon, saying she should let me rest. Carla walked her to the door, their voices pleasant and light, talking about nothing important. I heard Linda's footsteps in the hallway, growing fainter, then the sound of her door opening and closing 3 apartments down. Carla returned to the living room and asked if I'd like a cookie with my tea. I told her not right now, maybe later. She took the container to the kitchen, and I heard the cupboard open and close as she put it away. My hand stayed closed around the note, the paper growing damp from my palm's sweat. The afternoon passed with unbearable slowness. Carla helped me with my afternoon exercises, prepared an early dinner, chatted about a movie she'd watched last night. I responded automatically, my mind elsewhere, hyper-aware of the folded paper I'd tucked into my cardigan pocket when she wasn't looking. After Carla left for the day at 4, I sat for a long time before retrieving the note. The apartment was very quiet. Outside my window, the light was fading, that gray twilight that came earlier now as we moved deeper into autumn. I could hear the building settling around me, the distant hum of someone's television, the creak of pipes, footsteps on the floor above. Finally, I made my way to the bedroom. The journey seemed longer than usual, my hip aching more than it had all day, though I suspected that was tension rather than injury. I sat on the edge of my bed and unfolded the note with trembling fingers. Linda's handwriting was shaky but clear, the letters formed with careful precision as if she'd written it multiple times to get it right. The words were simple, just 6 of them, but they made my stomach turn cold. "You're not her first." I read it 3 times, each reading making the words more real, more terrible. The bedroom had grown dark around me, shadows filling the corners, but I didn't reach for the lamp. I just sat there holding the note, feeling the paper thin and fragile between my fingers. Then I folded it again, carefully, along the same creases Linda had made, and tucked it under my pillow. The pillowcase was cool cotton, freshly changed by Carla just yesterday. I lay down fully clothed on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me. The radiator clanked as it came to life. Someone walked past my door in the hallway. A car alarm went off on the street below, then stopped. That night I didn't sleep at all. I lay in the darkness with my hand under the pillow, feeling the sharp edges of folded paper, and wondered how many others there had been before me. How many other elderly people living alone, vulnerable and trusting. How many other homes Carla had entered with her practiced smile and her tote bag full of whatever she used to make herself indispensable. The clock on my nightstand glowed faintly. 10:47, then 11:23, then 12:15. The numbers changed but sleep never came, and with each passing hour, the weight of what I knew grew heavier. Sunday morning I waited until I was sure Carla wouldn't arrive early. The agency had said weekends were my choice, and I'd told them I didn't need help on Sundays. I needed this day alone, needed the space to think without her presence filling every corner of my apartment. I needed to know who she was. My laptop sat on the desk in the corner where it had been gathering dust since before the surgery. It looked like a relic from another life, from a version of myself who still checked email regularly and read the news online and felt connected to the wider world. Now it just sat there, a gray rectangle slowly accumulating the fine layer of dust that settled on everything. It took me 20 minutes to get there with my walker, my hip screaming with each step. The pain was worse today, maybe from the sleepless night, maybe from the tension that had taken up residence in my shoulders and refused to let go. Squeak, step, pause. Squeak, step, pause. The morning light streamed through the windows, making the dust particles visible in the air, thousands of tiny specks floating in the golden shafts of sunlight. I lowered myself into the desk chair, grateful to be off my feet, and opened the laptop. It took forever to boot up, the screen glowing pale blue, then black, then finally showing the desktop image a photo Sarah had set for me years ago. Some generic mountain landscape I'd never bothered to change. The internet connection took even longer, the little spinning circle mocking me with its endlessness. The agency paperwork was in the folder on top of the desk, exactly where I'd left it when Carla first arrived. Her name was typed neatly on the form, Carla Jensen. I stared at it for a moment, those two simple words that should have told me everything I needed to know but somehow told me nothing at all. I typed the name into the search bar, my fingers clumsy on the keys. I'd never been particularly skilled with computers. Harold had been the one who understood technology, who had set up our first email account and patiently shown me how to use it. After he died, I'd struggled along, learning slowly, but it had never come naturally. The results came back immediately. There were several Carla Jensens. A dentist in Oregon with a bright smile in her profile photo. A college student in Florida, barely 20, posing at what looked like a beach party. A real estate agent in Texas wearing a blazer and holding a clipboard. I clicked through the images one by one, searching for the face I'd been watching all week, the face that had become as familiar as my own reflection. None of them matched. None of them had her eyes, her particular shade of brown hair, the shape of her face. None of them were her. I tried adding the agency name to the search. Carla Jensen Sunrise Home Care. The results shifted but didn't improve. I found the agency's website and navigated to their list of certified aides, my hand unsteady on the mouse, accidentally clicking things I didn't mean to click, having to go back and start over. Carla's name was there on the list, alphabetically arranged with all the other aides, but when I clicked on her profile, there was no photo, just a generic silhouette, the kind of placeholder image that meant nothing. A brief description that could have fit anyone: certified home health aide with 5 years of experience, specializes in post-surgical care and elderly assistance. 5 years of experience. But doing what? And for whom? My hands were shaking now, making it difficult to type. I searched for home care aide complaints, for fraud cases, for anything that might explain what Linda's note had meant. I found articles about elder abuse, about financial exploitation, about caregivers who stole from their patients. The stories made me feel sick, made the room seem smaller, the walls closer. But nothing about Carla Jensen specifically. Nothing that would give me answers. I tried different combinations of search terms. Carla Jensen arrested. Carla Jensen fraud. Carla Jensen elderly. The screen filled with results that meant nothing. Pages and pages of information about people who weren't her, cases that weren't mine, stories that didn't help. The laptop screen blurred in front of me and I realized I was crying, hot tears running down my cheeks, dripping onto the keyboard. I couldn't remember the last time I'd cried like this, with this kind of helpless frustration. Maybe at Harold's funeral. Maybe when Sarah had moved across the country for her job and I'd realized how truly alone I would be. Because the truth was settling over me like a weight I couldn't push off, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know who was coming through my door every morning at 9. I didn't know whose hands touched my possessions, prepared my food, managed my medications. I didn't know who I'd let into my home, into my life, into the most vulnerable moments of my recovery. The woman I called Carla might not even be named Carla. I closed the laptop and sat there in the desk chair, staring at nothing, feeling the morning sun warm on my back. Outside, the city continued its Sunday rhythm, car doors slamming, someone laughing, the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. Normal life, happening all around me, while I sat in my apartment realizing that nothing about my situation was normal at all. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, someone would knock on my door. And I had no idea who she really was. I found the agency's number on the paperwork and dialed with trembling fingers. Each digit required concentration, my index finger shaking as I pressed the numbers on my phone. I had to start over twice, misdialing, the automated voice telling me the number I'd reached was not in service. The third time, I went slowly, deliberately, reading each number aloud to myself like a child learning to count. It rang 4 times before someone answered. Each ring felt impossibly long, stretching out in the silence of my apartment. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, that steady mechanical heartbeat that usually faded into background noise but now seemed deafening. Tick, tick, tick. A young woman answered with a bored voice, the kind of tone that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else, doing anything else. She told me I'd reached Sunrise Home Care Services and asked how she could help me today. My mouth was dry. I tried to swallow but couldn't seem to produce enough saliva. The words came out rough, uncertain. I asked to speak to someone about my assigned aide, Carla Jensen. I gave them my name and address, my case number from the top of the form, reading it carefully to make sure I got every digit right. There was a pause. The sound of typing, fingers moving rapidly over a keyboard. Then a longer pause that made my chest tighten, made my heart beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with my medication. The woman asked me to hold. Her voice had changed slightly, lost some of that bored quality, gained something else. Concern, maybe, or confusion. Music played through the phone, something soft and meaningless, the kind of instrumental version of a popular song that played in elevators and waiting rooms. I held the phone against my ear, my hand cramping from gripping it too hard, and waited. The clock kept ticking. Outside my window, a pigeon landed on the sill, pecked at something, flew away. 2 minutes passed. 3. I watched the second hand sweep around the clock face, counting the rotations. The music stopped and started again from the beginning, the same melody repeating in an endless loop. Finally, a different voice came on the line. Older, male, with an edge of concern that was immediately apparent. He introduced himself as the director of the agency, Mr. Richardson, and asked me to repeat what I'd just said. His voice was careful, controlled, like someone trying not to alarm me while already being alarmed himself. I told him again, my voice steadier now despite the trembling in my hands. Carla Jensen. She'd been coming every day for the past 2 weeks. 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Helping me recover from hip surgery. The words came out mechanically, a recitation of facts that felt surreal as I spoke them. The silence that followed was worse than any answer could have been. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could hear the sound of him shifting in his chair, papers rustling. The silence stretched and stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. Then he spoke, and his words came carefully, deliberately, each one weighted with significance. He told me there had been a mistake. That this was very serious. That Carla Jensen was no longer employed with their agency. She'd been terminated last month for policy violations. He didn't elaborate on what those violations were, but the word terminated hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Then he asked if she was in my home right now. His voice had gone tight with something like fear, like urgency barely contained beneath professional courtesy. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. My palm was slick with sweat, the plastic suddenly too smooth to grip properly. I managed to hold on, pressing it harder against my ear. I told him no, that it was Sunday, that she'd be back tomorrow morning at 9. The clock kept ticking. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the walls shifting in my peripheral vision. He told me not to let her in. His voice was firm now, directive. He told me to call the police immediately. He said someone from the agency would be in touch, that they would investigate how this had happened, that he was deeply sorry. But right now, he repeated, I needed to call the police. I hung up and sat there staring at nothing, the phone still in my hand, my mind unable to catch up with what I'd just heard. The apartment felt different now, contaminated somehow. Every surface she'd touched, every room she'd entered, every moment she'd spent here suddenly felt sinister, threatening. The clock kept ticking, marking time moving forward whether I was ready or not. Tomorrow at 9, someone would knock on my door. And I finally understood that I had no idea who she really was. Monday morning the knock came at exactly 9, just like always. 3 sharp raps, then her voice calling out a cheerful greeting. The sound made my stomach clench, made every muscle in my body go rigid with tension. I had been sitting in my armchair since dawn, my walker beside me, my phone in my pocket. I'd rehearsed what I would do over and over during the sleepless night. Stay calm. Act normal. Don't let her in. Wait for her to leave, then call the police like the agency director had told me to. But when I opened the door and saw her standing there with that practiced smile, her tote bag over her shoulder, her scrubs crisp and professional, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was anger finally breaking through the fear. Maybe it was the need to understand, to know why, to hear it from her own mouth. Maybe I was just tired of being afraid in my own home, tired of being the vulnerable old woman everyone seemed to think I was. The morning air from the hallway was cool against my face, carrying the smell of coffee from someone else's apartment, the faint chemical scent of carpet cleaner from the maintenance crew. Normal smells. Ordinary morning smells. I let her in. She stepped past me, already moving toward the kitchen, already settling into the routine we'd established. She asked how I'd slept, if my hip was feeling better, if I'd taken my morning pills yet. Her voice was warm, concerned, exactly as it always was. She set her tote bag on the counter with that familiar thump, turned on the kitchen light even though the morning sun was already bright through the windows. I closed the door and stood there, one hand still on the knob, watching her move through my space. She filled the electric kettle with water, got out the tea bags, pulled my mug from the cabinet. She knew where everything was now. She'd made herself at home. The morning passed like all the others, but I was aware of every moment in a way I hadn't been before. She made breakfast scrambled eggs, the smell filling the kitchen, butter sizzling in the pan. She helped me with my exercises, counting aloud while I lifted and lowered my legs, her hands gentle when she adjusted my position. She chatted about nothing important, filling the silence with words that meant nothing, stories that might or might not be true. I played along, nodding at the right moments, responding when expected. But my hands were shaking. Every time she came near, every time she touched me or handed me something, I had to fight the urge to pull away, to scream, to demand answers. At lunch, I watched her set the plate in front of me. Chicken salad, the way she knew I liked it, with grapes and walnuts, served on the good china I rarely used anymore. She'd made it look nice, arranged it carefully, like she cared about presentation, like she cared about me. She sat down across from me with her own plate, still smiling that practiced smile. I told her I'd called the agency yesterday. My voice sounded remarkably steady, casual even. Just a routine question about scheduling, I said. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Surprise. Or maybe calculation. She set the fork down carefully, precisely, the metal clicking softly against the ceramic plate. She asked what they'd said. Her voice was still warm, but there was something underneath it now, something careful and watchful. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, a car drove past, its engine fading into the distance. The refrigerator hummed its constant note. I told her the truth. That they'd said she didn't work there anymore. That she'd been let go last month. I watched her face as I spoke, searching for any reaction, any explanation that would make this make sense. The air in the room changed. It happened so gradually I almost didn't notice at first, like the pressure dropping before a storm. Carla sat very still across from me, her hands resting on either side of her plate. She didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there looking at me with those brown eyes that suddenly seemed different somehow. Harder. Colder. Then she smiled. But this smile was nothing like the one she'd worn every day for the past 2 weeks. This smile had no warmth in it, no practiced friendliness. It was cold and sharp and utterly real, more honest than anything else she'd shown me. It was the smile of someone who'd been wearing a mask and had finally decided to take it off. She told me that if I'd called the agency, then I already knew too much. Her voice was different now. Flat. Empty of all that false concern. The voice of someone who was done pretending. The apartment felt very small suddenly. The distance to the door seemed impossibly far. My phone was in my pocket but my hands felt too heavy to reach for it. And Carla just sat there, smiling that cold smile, waiting to see what I would do next. Carla stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made me flinch. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with her back to me, and the silence felt like a hand closing around my throat, squeezing slowly, deliberately. I gripped the edge of the table, my fingers pressing into the wood until I could feel the grain beneath them, rough and real. My mind raced through options I didn't have. The phone was in my pocket but my fingers felt numb, disconnected from my body. The door was 20 feet away and might as well have been a mile, an impossible distance for someone who could barely walk without pain. Then she turned around holding my medication basket, and something about the way she looked at it casual, proprietary, like it belonged to her rather than to me made my blood run cold. She brought it back to the table and set it down between us with a soft thud. The bottles clinked against each other, that familiar sound I'd heard every day, twice a day, for years. But now it sounded different. Ominous. Like a warning I should have heard weeks ago. She told me we should talk about my medications, that she'd been managing them very carefully for the past 2 weeks. Her voice was almost conversational, like we were discussing the weather or what to have for dinner. The afternoon light came through the window behind her, making her face harder to see, turning her into a silhouette with that cold smile still visible. I looked down at the bottles and organizer spread out before me. 7 bottles of various sizes, the plastic amber-colored and slightly translucent, labels printed with my name and instructions I'd memorized years ago. The weekly organizer with its 7 compartments, each divided into morning and evening doses. That's when I saw it. The labels were slightly different than I remembered. Not obviously wrong, not glaringly altered, but different in small ways my eyes hadn't registered until now. The font on one bottle seemed a fraction smaller. The color of another label wasn't quite the same shade of white. These were details I'd seen 1,000 times, details my brain had catalogued without my conscious awareness. And now that I was really looking, I could see the wrongness. The pills in the Tuesday compartment weren't quite the right shade of blue. My blood pressure medication was supposed to be a deep navy, almost purple in certain light. These were lighter, more turquoise. The difference was subtle, barely noticeable. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as a trick of the light or a change in your vision. But I'd been taking those pills for 5 years. I knew their color the way I knew the color of my own eyes. The largest bottle had been moved to the front when it had always been in the back. I kept my thyroid medication at the back because I took it first, before food, and the muscle memory of reaching past the other bottles was ingrained in my morning routine. But now it sat in front, prominent, unavoidable. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat, could hear it pulsing in my ears. I asked her what she'd done. My voice came out barely above a whisper, thin and frightened in a way that embarrassed me even as terror overwhelmed everything else. She tilted her head, studying me like I was a problem she was trying to solve, like I was a particularly interesting specimen under glass. The afternoon light through the window made her face look harsh, unfamiliar, all the softness gone. She told me I'd been taking exactly what she'd given me, every single day, without question. She said it was remarkable how trusting old people could be. How they'd swallow anything you put in their hand. Accept any explanation you offered. Believe whatever you told them because the alternative that someone was hurting them deliberately was too terrible to contemplate. The room started to spin, just slightly at first, the edges of my vision blurring. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something worse. Something already working through my system, chemicals and compounds that didn't belong there, that were doing things to my body I couldn't understand or stop. My mouth felt dry, my tongue too thick. The light seemed brighter suddenly, painful, making my eyes water. I tried to stand but my legs wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't hold my weight the way they should. Carla just watched, her expression neutral now, clinical. Waiting to see what would happen next. I couldn't tell if I was dizzy from terror or from whatever she'd been giving me for 2 weeks. Couldn't tell if my racing heart was panic or poison. Couldn't tell if the way the room tilted and swayed was my mind breaking or my body shutting down. The distinction seemed important, seemed like something I should know. But I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell. Carla stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made me flinch. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with her back to me, and the silence felt like a hand closing around my throat, squeezing slowly, deliberately. I gripped the edge of the table, my fingers pressing into the wood until I could feel the grain beneath them, rough and real. My mind raced through options I didn't have. The phone was in my pocket but my fingers felt numb, disconnected from my body. The door was 20 feet away and might as well have been a mile, an impossible distance for someone who could barely walk without pain. Then she turned around holding my medication basket, and something about the way she looked at it, casual, proprietary, like it belonged to her rather than to me, made my blood run cold. She brought it back to the table and set it down between us with a soft thud. The bottles clinked against each other, that familiar sound I'd heard every day, twice a day, for years. But now it sounded different. Ominous. Like a warning I should have heard weeks ago. She told me we should talk about my medications, that she'd been managing them very carefully for the past 2 weeks. Her voice was almost conversational, like we were discussing the weather or what to have for dinner. The afternoon light came through the window behind her, making her face harder to see, turning her into a silhouette with that cold smile still visible. I looked down at the bottles and organizer spread out before me. 7 bottles of various sizes, the plastic amber-colored and slightly translucent, labels printed with my name and instructions I'd memorized years ago. The weekly organizer with its 7 compartments, each divided into morning and evening doses. That's when I saw it. The labels were slightly different than I remembered. Not obviously wrong, not glaringly altered, but different in small ways my eyes hadn't registered until now. The font on one bottle seemed a fraction smaller. The color of another label wasn't quite the same shade of white. These were details I'd seen 1,000 times, details my brain had catalogued without my conscious awareness. And now that I was really looking, I could see the wrongness. The pills in the Tuesday compartment weren't quite the right shade of blue. My blood pressure medication was supposed to be a deep navy, almost purple in certain light. These were lighter, more turquoise. The difference was subtle, barely noticeable. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as a trick of the light or a change in your vision. But I'd been taking those pills for 5 years. I knew their color the way I knew the color of my own eyes. The largest bottle had been moved to the front when it had always been in the back. I kept my thyroid medication at the back because I took it first, before food, and the muscle memory of reaching past the other bottles was ingrained in my morning routine. But now it sat in front, prominent, unavoidable. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat, could hear it pulsing in my ears. I asked her what she'd done. My voice came out barely above a whisper, thin and frightened in a way that embarrassed me even as terror overwhelmed everything else. She tilted her head, studying me like I was a problem she was trying to solve, like I was a particularly interesting specimen under glass. The afternoon light through the window made her face look harsh, unfamiliar, all the softness gone. She told me I'd been taking exactly what she'd given me, every single day, without question. She said it was remarkable how trusting old people could be. How they'd swallow anything you put in their hand. Accept any explanation you offered. Believe whatever you told them because the alternative that someone was hurting them deliberately was too terrible to contemplate. The room started to spin, just slightly at first, the edges of my vision blurring. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something worse. Something already working through my system, chemicals and compounds that didn't belong there, that were doing things to my body I couldn't understand or stop. My mouth felt dry, my tongue too thick. The light seemed brighter suddenly, painful, making my eyes water. I tried to stand but my legs wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't hold my weight the way they should. Carla just watched, her expression neutral now, clinical. Waiting to see what would happen next. I couldn't tell if I was dizzy from terror or from whatever she'd been giving me for 2 weeks. Couldn't tell if my racing heart was panic or poison. Couldn't tell if the way the room tilted and swayed was my mind breaking or my body shutting down. The distinction seemed important, seemed like something I should know. But I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell. Carla left at 4, just like always. She told me she'd see me tomorrow, her voice pleasant again, as if our lunch conversation had never happened, as if she hadn't just implied she'd been poisoning me for 2 weeks. She gathered her tote bag, checked that I had water within reach, reminded me to take my evening medications I would never touch again, and walked out the door with that same practiced smile. The moment the lock clicked, I called Linda. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone, could barely press the right numbers. The call went through and rang once, twice, and I thought wildly that she might not be home, that I might have to wait, that I might have to face this alone. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her I needed her to come over immediately, that it was urgent. My voice broke on the last word and I heard her sharp intake of breath, heard the immediate concern in her response. She told me she'd be right there. She was at my apartment within 5 minutes, her face pale, her breathing slightly labored from hurrying despite her arthritis. I opened the door and she took one look at me and pulled me into a hug, careful of my hip, her arms thin but strong around my shoulders. I remembered suddenly the day Harold died, how Linda had been the one who'd sat with me through that first terrible night, who'd held my hand and let me cry without trying to fix anything. We pulled apart and she followed me inside, closing the door firmly behind her. I told her everything. The fake name, the agency call, the medications, the cold smile, the veiled threats. The words tumbled out in a rush, disorganized and desperate, and she listened without interrupting, her expression growing more horrified with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her jaw tight, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Then she told me we were calling the police right now. Her voice was fierce, protective, the voice of someone who wouldn't let harm come to a friend if she could prevent it. But I stopped her. I grabbed her wrist, felt the fragile bones beneath the thin skin, and told her I had no proof, that it would be my word against Carla's, that I was a confused old woman on pain medication who might be imagining things. That's what they'd think. That's what Carla would say. That's what everyone would believe because it was easier than believing someone would do this deliberately. Linda pulled her hand away and stood up, pacing to the window and back, her movements agitated despite the pain I knew it caused her. She told me she didn't care what they'd think, that my safety mattered more than proof. But I knew better. I'd lived long enough to know that sometimes being right wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed evidence. Sometimes you needed to be able to prove the impossible before anyone would believe you. Linda was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the street below. Then she told me to wait, that she had an idea. She left before I could ask what she meant, and I sat there in my chair, exhausted and frightened, listening to the silence of my apartment. She came back 20 minutes later with a small package from the electronics store down the street, slightly out of breath from the walk. A cheap camera, the kind people used for home security, nanny cams they called them, small enough to hide, good enough to record. She pulled it from the bag with trembling hands that matched my own, and together we read the instructions. Two old women trying to understand technology that should have been simple but felt impossibly complex. We spent the next hour positioning it behind the flower pot on the bookshelf, the one with the trailing ivy that had been there so long it was part of the furniture. The angle was perfect, it faced the kitchen and dining table, would catch everything that happened in those spaces. Linda tested it 3 times, recording short clips and playing them back on my laptop, making sure the quality was good enough, that you could see faces clearly, that sound would be audible. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, making long shadows across the floor, and I thought about how ordinary everything looked, how normal. My apartment, my things, my life, all of it exactly as it had always been. Except for the small camera hidden in the ivy, recording secrets I didn't want to know. Before Linda left, she made me promise to be careful, to not let on that anything had changed. She held both my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong, and told me she was proud of me, that what I was doing took courage. I walked her to the door and watched her disappear down the hallway toward her own apartment. Then I closed the door, locked it, put the chain on for the first time in years. I stood there in the entryway of my home, one hand still on the door, and made myself a promise. Tomorrow I would smile and pretend. Tomorrow I would act confused and compliant. Tomorrow I would be exactly what Carla expected me to be. But I would know the truth. And soon, I would have proof. Tuesday passed in a fog of pretending. I smiled when Carla arrived, the morning air bringing in the smell of car exhaust and coffee from somewhere down the street. I took the pills she handed me and tucked them under my tongue, the bitter taste making me want to gag, then spat them into a tissue when she turned away to get my water. I ate the food she prepared, forcing down every bite while my stomach churned with nausea that had nothing to do with the food itself. I acted like a confused old woman who suspected nothing, who had accepted her explanations, who trusted her completely. It was the hardest performance of my life. When she finally left at 4, I waited 10 minutes to be sure she wasn't coming back. I sat perfectly still in my chair, counting the seconds, listening for any sound in the hallway that might signal her return. The building was quiet except for the usual sounds: the elevator chiming on a different floor, someone's television playing too loud, the radiator beginning its evening tick and clank. Then I made my way to the bookshelf, my legs barely holding me up. The journey across the room felt longer than usual, my hip screaming with every step, though I suspected the pain had less to do with the surgery and more to do with the tension that had taken up permanent residence in my body. Linda had shown me how to play back the footage on my laptop, had written down the steps on a piece of paper in her careful handwriting. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to connect the camera's memory card to the computer, the small piece of plastic slipping from my fingers twice before I finally got it inserted properly. I sat at the desk and opened the playback file. The screen filled with an image of my apartment from an angle I'd never seen before, slightly elevated, looking down at the kitchen and dining area. It felt strange seeing my home this way, like viewing someone else's life. The video started playing. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Just the empty apartment, afternoon light moving slowly across the floor, the occasional sound of traffic from outside. I fast-forwarded, watching the timestamp in the corner change: 30 minutes, 45, an hour. Then I saw movement. There was Carla, just minutes after I'd fallen asleep in my chair that afternoon. I watched her stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking back toward where I sat sleeping out of frame. She was checking, making sure I was truly asleep, that I wouldn't wake and catch her. Then she moved quickly through my apartment, and all the casual warmth drained from her body language. She became focused, efficient, purposeful. She opened drawers in the kitchen, the sideboard, checking contents and closing them again. Not searching randomly but looking for specific things, her movements practiced and sure. She went into my bedroom and I watched her go straight to that top dresser drawer, the one I never left open. No hesitation, no uncertainty. She knew exactly where to go. She pulled out my jewelry box, examined the contents piece by piece, held my mother's ring up to the light, then put everything back. She took nothing this time, but the way she handled my things, that casual ownership, that sense of entitlement, made my chest tighten with rage. Then she went to the medication basket on the counter. The camera angle was perfect. I could see everything. I watched her unscrew one of the bottles, pour pills into her palm. 5 of them, small and blue. She capped that bottle and pulled a different one from her tote bag, shook out 5 different pills, dropped them into my bottle. She did this with 3 bottles total, methodical and calm, like someone who'd done it many times before, who had a system perfected through repetition. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The room had grown dark around me while I watched, shadows filling the corners, but I didn't reach for the lamp. I sat in the glow of the laptop screen, the light making my hands look ghostly and pale. After replacing the pills, Carla made a phone call. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed, then waited, leaning against my counter like she owned it. When someone answered, her expression changed. Became businesslike. Professional. I couldn't hear the words, the camera hadn't picked up the audio clearly enough, but I could read her lips. I'd learned to lip read a little when Harold started losing his hearing, and while I was far from fluent, I could make out enough. The old woman. Soon. No complications expected. She was talking about me. Planning something. Coordinating with someone else. This wasn't just theft or medication tampering. This was bigger, more organized, more dangerous than I'd imagined. The video ended and the screen froze on the last frame. Carla's face in profile, the phone against her ear, her expression cold and calculating. I sat there staring at that frozen image, finally seeing who she really was. Not the warm caregiver with the practiced smile. Not the helpful young woman who'd promised to take care of me, but this calculating predator who'd been circling closer, waiting for the right moment to strike. The laptop's glow illuminated my face in the darkness, and I realized I was crying again. But this time the tears weren't from fear or helplessness. They were from rage. From the crystalline clarity of finally understanding, of having proof that I wasn't confused or paranoid or imagining things. I had her. Right here on this screen, frozen in the act, undeniable and real. And tomorrow at 9, when she knocked on my door with that practiced smile, I would be ready. Wednesday morning I was ready. I'd called Linda at 7 and told her to wait in her apartment, to keep her door cracked open, to call the police if she heard anything concerning. My voice had been steady on the phone, steadier than I'd expected, and I realized somewhere in the sleepless night I'd stopped being afraid. Fear had burned away, leaving something harder in its place. I'd positioned my walker between me and the door. My phone was in my pocket, fully charged, Linda's number already pulled up on the screen. I sat in my armchair and waited, watching the morning light creep across the floor one last time with Carla on the other side of my door. When the knock came at 9, I was calm. I stood slowly, gripping the walker, and made my way to the door. Each step deliberate. Each movement measured. The sunrise painted the walls gold, beautiful and indifferent to what was about to happen. I opened the door but didn't step back. Carla stood there with her tote bag over her shoulder and that practiced smile on her face, ready to begin another day of whatever she'd been doing to me. She looked the same as always, navy scrubs, hair pulled back, that expression of gentle concern already forming as she started to step inside. I told her no. The word came out firm, clear, undeniable. She stopped, her foot halfway across the threshold, confusion flickering across her face. I told her I knew everything. The words felt powerful in my mouth, felt true in a way that cut through all her lies. I told her I had video evidence of her going through my things, tampering with my medications, that I'd spoken to the real agency, that they'd confirmed she'd been fired, that I knew she'd been lying about everything from the moment she'd walked through my door. I told her she needed to leave now and never come back. For a moment, she just stared at me. Her smile didn't fade right away. It melted slowly, like wax under heat, transforming her face into something I hadn't seen before. The mask she'd worn for 2 weeks slipped away completely, revealing what had been underneath all along. Cold calculation. Contempt. Something predatory that had been hidden behind false warmth. She told me I was confused, her voice taking on that gentle, condescending tone she'd used before. That I was sick, that the surgery had affected my thinking, that I needed her help whether I realized it or not. She took a step forward, trying to push past me into my apartment. I stood my ground. My hands gripped the walker handles so hard my knuckles went white, my whole body shaking with the effort of staying upright, of not backing down. I told her the police were already involved. That the evidence was already saved in multiple locations, that copies had been sent to the agency and to my daughter. That if she didn't leave immediately, I would scream loud enough for every neighbor on this floor to hear. My voice was loud now, louder than I'd spoken in years. I heard a door open somewhere down the hall, Linda's door, and maybe others. I heard footsteps, whispered conversations. Witnesses. For a long moment we just stared at each other. I could smell her perfume, that floral sweetness that had permeated my apartment for 2 weeks. Could see the calculations happening behind her eyes as she weighed her options. Then something shifted in her expression. She took a step back, but her eyes stayed locked on mine. The hatred in that look was pure and undisguised. She told me this wasn't over. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, meant only for me. She told me I had no idea who I was dealing with, that I'd made a serious mistake. She told me that old women living alone had accidents all the time. Terrible accidents. They fell. They forgot to turn off the stove. They took the wrong medications. Things happened to fragile old women, and no one was ever surprised. The threat hung in the air between us, sharp and real and unmistakable. Then she turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls. She didn't look back until she reached the elevator. When she did, the promise in that look made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't the end. We both knew it. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. She stepped inside, and for a moment we locked eyes one last time across the length of the hallway. Then the doors slid shut with a quiet mechanical hiss, and she was gone. I stood there in my doorway, still gripping my walker, my whole body trembling now that it was over. Linda appeared beside me, her hand on my arm, asking if I was all right. Other neighbors had emerged from their apartments, concerned faces asking what had happened, but I barely heard them. I was listening to the sound of the elevator descending, carrying Carla away from my floor, out of my building, out of my immediate life, but not gone. Not really. The echo of those closing doors seemed to reverberate through the building, through my bones. A sound I knew I would hear in my dreams. Old women have accidents all the time. The police came that afternoon and took my statement. 2 officers, one young and eager, one older with kind eyes that had seen too much. They sat in my living room and listened while I told them everything, while Linda sat beside me for support, her hand occasionally squeezing mine when the words became difficult. They copied the video footage onto a department laptop, wrote down everything I could remember in careful detail, asked questions that made me relive it all again. They told me they were opening an investigation. That I'd done the right thing by gathering evidence. That cases like this were more common than people realized. That vulnerable adults were targeted every day by people who knew exactly how to exploit trust. The agency director came the next day, apologetic and horrified in equal measure. He sat in the same chair Carla had sat in, and I had to fight the urge to tell him to move, that her presence had contaminated that space. He assured me this had never happened before, that their screening process was rigorous, that they would be reviewing their procedures. He told me they took full responsibility, that they would cover any costs associated with what had happened. But apologies couldn't undo what had been done. Couldn't erase the 2 weeks of fear and violation. Couldn't remove whatever she'd been giving me from my system. Couldn't give me back the sense of safety I'd lost. Linda came with me to the locksmith on Friday. We took a taxi because neither of us could manage the bus, and she insisted on paying despite my protests. The locksmith was a middle-aged man with gentle hands and infinite patience. He came to my apartment with his toolbox and his key-cutting machine, and I watched him dismantle the old locks I'd trusted for 15 years. The sound of the drill was loud in my quiet apartment, sharp and aggressive, but somehow cleansing. He removed the old hardware and installed new deadbolts, solid and heavy, the kind that couldn't be picked or bypassed. He added a chain to the door, showed me how to slide it into place, the metal making a satisfying click when it locked. He cut new keys while I sat in my chair, the machine making a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. The smell of fresh cut metal lingered in the hallway afterward, sharp and clean, the scent of security being restored. He handed me 3 copies, the metal still warm from the cutting, and walked me through how each lock worked. Once, twice, 3 times, until I felt confident, until the movements became natural, until my shaking hands could operate them smoothly. After he left, I practiced locking and unlocking for 20 minutes, feeling the solid click of the deadbolt sliding home, the weight of the chain in my palm. These weren't the old familiar locks I'd operated without thinking for years. These were new, different, mine. On Saturday, I changed my phone number. The process was easier than I'd expected. A call to the phone company, a brief explanation, a promise that the new number would be active within hours. I went through my contacts one by one, calling Sarah first. My daughter answered on the second ring, her voice full of immediate concern at the unexpected call. I told her about the new number, and when she asked why, I finally told her everything. I'd been protecting her, not wanting to worry her when she lived so far away and couldn't help. But she deserved to know. She deserved the truth. She cried. Then she got angry, not at me, but at the situation, at Carla, at herself for not knowing. She told me she was taking time off work, that she was coming to visit next week, that she should have been there all along. I told her she didn't need to do that, but she insisted, and I realized I was grateful. I wanted to see her. Wanted to hold her and be held and remember what it felt like to trust someone completely. I called the few friends I still had after that, gave them the new number, listened to their concern and their offers of help. Each call felt like taking back a piece of myself, like reclaiming connections that Carla had tried to sever. Sunday morning I woke up in my own apartment and for the first time in 3 weeks, I felt like it was truly mine again. The sunrise came through my window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. I lay in bed for a while, just breathing, listening to the familiar sounds of the building waking up around me. The radiator beginning its morning clank. Footsteps above. A door closing down the hall. Ordinary sounds that had been frightening now returning to normal. I got up slowly, testing my hip. The pain was less than it had been, the healing progressing the way the doctors had promised. I made my own breakfast, toast and tea, simple and mine. I managed my own medications, checking each pill carefully before taking it, relearning trust in my own judgment. I moved through my rooms without that crawling sensation of being watched, without the constant awareness of another presence. The apartment smelled like my lavender sachets again, the floral sweetness of Carla's perfume finally fading. The ceramic bird was back in its proper place on the windowsill, facing the direction I'd originally set it. Everything was where it should be. I stood at the window and breathed deeply, watching the street below come to life with the new day. The morning air that slipped through the slightly open window was cool and fresh, carrying the smell of someone's coffee, car exhaust, the city waking up. The light was soft and forgiving, and I stood there bathed in it, finally at peace. 3 months later, I could walk without the walker. The physical therapist said I'd made remarkable progress, that my determination had carried me further than most patients my age. She didn't know about the other kind of strength I'd had to find, the kind that had nothing to do with bones and muscles, the kind that came from standing up when everything in you wanted to collapse. The hip barely troubled me now except on cold mornings when the old injury remembered itself with a dull ache. I moved through my apartment with increasing confidence, relearning the geography of my own space, reclaiming territory that had been invaded and was now mine again. I thought about Carla sometimes, though less as the weeks passed. The police had found 2 other victims, both elderly, both living alone, both targeted in exactly the same way. She'd used different names with each of them: Jennifer Martin, Carol Henderson, different agencies, always moving before anyone caught on. They were still looking for her, the detective told me during his follow-up calls. But people like her knew how to disappear, how to reinvent themselves and find new victims in new cities. I hoped they would find her. Hoped she would be stopped before she could hurt anyone else. But I also accepted that I might never know how the story ended, that some questions would remain unanswered. I'd learned to live with that uncertainty, to find peace despite it. Linda and I had tea every Tuesday now. She'd knock on my door at 3 in the afternoon. And I'd have the kettle already boiling, 2 cups set out with the good china we'd both stopped using years ago because it seemed too precious for every day. But we'd decided life was too short to save the good things. We used them now, every week, and they made the tea taste better somehow. We never talked directly about what had happened, but sometimes our conversations would circle around it. About trust and how hard it was to give once it had been broken. About vulnerability and the strange mathematics of aging that made you need help while also making you a target. About the strength it took to ask for help again after being hurt by it. The tea was always Earl Grey, the way we both liked it. And sometimes we'd sit in comfortable silence, watching the light change through the windows, 2 old women who'd survived and were still here, still drinking tea, still finding reasons to laugh. Sarah visited more often now. She'd been horrified when I finally told her everything, had cried on my shoulder like she used to when she was a little girl and the world hurt her. She'd felt guilty that she hadn't known, hadn't been there, hadn't protected me. I'd reminded her that I was still her mother, that I'd protected myself in the end, that she'd raised me to be strong even if she didn't realize it. We'd laughed at that, at the reversal, at how our roles kept shifting as we both grew older. She came once a month now instead of every few months, sometimes staying the weekend, sleeping in her old bedroom that I'd kept exactly as she'd left it. We'd cook together, my movements slow but steady, hers quick and efficient, and we'd talk about everything and nothing. She'd check my medications, not because she didn't trust me but because it made her feel better, and I let her because I understood that need. One morning I stood at my window with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the buildings gold. The smell of fresh coffee filled my apartment, rich and dark, mixed with the faint scent of the lavender soap I'd bought for myself, the kind that reminded me of my mother's garden when I was young. I thought about those weeks with Carla, how she'd been paid to help me stand, to help me heal, to help me recover from surgery and return to independence. But in the end, I'd had to learn to stand up for myself in ways that had nothing to do with physical therapy. I'd had to find a different kind of strength. The kind that came from recognizing danger and refusing to be a victim, from gathering evidence and demanding to be believed. The apartment was quiet around me, truly quiet now, filled only with sounds I chose and silence I controlled. My home, my space, my life, earned back one small victory at a time. The new locks on the door, solid and secure. The phone number that only people I trusted possessed. The knowledge that I was capable of protecting myself, that age hadn't made me helpless, just more careful. I took a sip of coffee and watched a bird land on the fire escape across the street. The sky was clear, promising a beautiful day. Below, the city was waking up, cars starting, people walking dogs, someone opening a shop, pulling up the metal grate with a rattle and clang. Normal life, continuing, indifferent to individual struggles but somehow comforting in its constancy. The morning light touched everything gently, the rooftops, the windows, the street below, and my face as I stood at the window. It was warm and forgiving, this light, asking nothing, offering everything. I closed my eyes and felt it on my skin, felt the peace that had been so hard to find settling into my bones. And for the first time in months, for the first time since I'd opened my door to a stranger with a practiced smile, I wasn't afraid.